الرحمن الرحيم. الحضور الكريم، السيدات والسادة،
لا،
أرحب
محمد not yet. Good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues, and everyone joining us online today. Welcome to Trends' third strategic dialogue titled The War in the Middle East: How Europe Sees the Crisis. The ongoing developments in the Middle East come at a particularly complex time for Europe. As the region faces escalating tensions, European governments are navigating multiple pressures, from energy security and strategic autonomy to broader geopolitical challenges. Today's dialogue will explore how Europe is interpreting and responding to the crisis, the extent of its strategic cohesion, and the implication for its role on the global stage. To begin, it is my pleasure to invite Mohammed Salmi, Senior Researcher and Head of the Researcher Sector at Trends Research and Advisory, to deliver the welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Sheikha. Sorry guys, I will speak in Arabic. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحضور الكريم، السيدات والسادة. أرحب بكم في هذا الحوار الاستراتيجي الثالث لمركز ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات، والذي يأتي في توقيت بالغ الحساسية في ظل أزمة إقليمية لم تعد تفهم ضمن إطار حرب تقليدية، بل كصراع مركب متعدد المستويات تتداخل فيه الأبعاد العسكرية مع الجيوسياسية والاقتصادية والأمنية التي تحاول أن تلقي بظلالها على المنطقة. ما نشهده اليوم في الشرق الأوسط يتجاوز كونه مواجهة مباشرة بين أطراف محددة، ليعكس نمطاً جديداً من الصراعات يقوم على التصعيد المتدرج وتعدد ساحات الاشتباك وتداخل الفاعلين الرسميين وغير الرسميين، ويستمر بمحاولة توسيع رقعة الصراع والحرب لتشمل أطرافاً لم تكن جزءاً منه، وذلك يجعل من احتواء الأزمة أمراً أكثر تعقيداً، ويزيد من احتمالات امتدادها جغرافياً ووظيفياً. وفي هذا السياق تبرز أوروبا كطرف متأثر بشكل مباشر نتيجة التأثيرات الاقتصادية والسياسية العميقة لهذه الأزمة، وارتباطها الوثيق بدول الخليج، خاصة في ملفات الطاقة والاستثمار وسلاسل الإمداد والتعاون الأمني. فالتطورات في الشرق الأوسط تنعكس بشكل فوري على الأسواق الأوروبية وعلى استقرارها الاقتصادي وعلى مواقفها السياسية، بما يضعها عملياً في قلب تداعيات هذه الأزمة. إن التحدي الذي تواجهه أوروبا اليوم لا يقتصر على التعامل مع هذه التداعيات، بل يمتد إلى اختبار قدرتها على الحفاظ على تماسكها السياسي والاقتصادي وتعزيز دورها في نظام دولي يشهد تحولات متسارعة. ومن هنا تطرح هذه الأزمة تساؤلات جوهرية حول حدود الفعل الأوروبي. هل تمتلك أوروبا أدوات استراتيجية مستقلة تمكنها من التأثير؟ وهل تستطيع موازنة التزاماتها عبر الأطلسي مع مصالحها المباشرة، خاصة في علاقتها مع دول الخليج؟ وإلى أي مدى يمكنها الإسهام في خفض التصعيد في ظل بيئة دولية تتسم بارتفاع مستويات الاستقطاب؟ الحضور الكريم، أهمية هذا الحوار يجب أن لا تقف فحسب على توصيف الواقع، بل تمتد إلى تحليل الاتجاهات المستقبلية واستكشاف السيناريوهات المحتملة، بما يدعم فهماً أعمق لصناع القرار ويسهم في تطوير أفكار مساهمة للاستجابة والتعاطي مع هذه الأزمة بشكل أكثر واقعية وفعالية. ختاماً، أتوجه بالشكر إلى جميع المشاركين والخبراء، ونتطلع إلى نقاش نوعي يعكس عمق الخبرات وتعدد المقاربات. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you for those insightful opening remarks. We will now move to our first panel, entitled Europe's Strategic Limits, Political Cohesion, and the Crisis of International Order. Our first panel will examine Europe's international dynamics and strategic positioning in light of the ongoing crisis. The discussion will explore questions around political cohesion, different national perspective across key European capitals, and the border implications for the international order. Moderating this session is Shamsa Al-Gbaisi, researcher at Trends Research and Advisory. Shamsa, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Shamsa Gbesi. I'm a researcher at Trends Research and Advisory, and it will be a pleasure to moderate this panel today. This panel is titled Europe's Strategic Limits, Political Cohesion, and the crisis of international order. At a time when global crises are becoming more complex and interconnected, Europe finds itself navigating not only external pressures, but also internal divisions, whether political, economic, or strategic. Today's panel will explore how these dynamics are shaping Europe's ability to respond and, perhaps more importantly, to lead. We are joined today by an excellent group of speakers. First, Professor Rafael Marchetti, Director of the Center for International and Strategic Studies, Luis University in Rome, General Gustave Cousteau, Secretary General of the European Institute for Counterterrorism and Conflict Prevention in Vienna. We also have Mr. Serge Stroubont, Executive Director, Bants Consulting in Belgium. And finally, Urs Unkauf, Extraordinary for Global External Affairs and Global Economic Network in Berlin. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us. Let's begin our discussion, but before we begin, just a quick note on timing. I will be giving each speaker around 10 minutes for their remarks so we can keep the discussion balanced and leave room for exchange. Just to respect your time, Mr. Unkauf, we will start with you. Given your work at the intersection of economic diplomacy, foreign trade, and energy policy, how do economic consideration, particularly energy security and external trade relations, shape Europe's positioning in this conflict, especially from a German and broader European perspective?
Good morning from Berlin. Thank you very much for having me, dear friends and colleagues, and especially for Trends Research and Advisory for organizing this virtual exchange, the strategic dialogue in a very timely manner, as we are at a point of crisis that is shaping the Middle East and the GCC region, and which is also seriously affecting on what the title of our panel already mentions, Europe's strategic limitations. So this is what I'm gonna present in the next few minutes, just to give you an overview on what is currently discussed in Germany, how the developments, the war in Iran and the crisis in the region is perceived, and what are the strategic implications. So basically, Europe's and especially Germany's positioning is fundamentally shaped by energy vulnerability. Despite an ongoing diversification since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the EU still relies heavily on global LNG and oil markets. Any Middle Eastern escalation threatens price spikes, reinforcing a strong European preference for de-escalation and stability over confrontation. From the German perspective, this sensitivity is even sharper. Germany's post-2022 shift away from Russian pipeline gas, increased dependency on LNG, notably from global markets like the United States and Qatar, making Berlin highly attentive to the Gulf security and maritime choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. Energy security thus directly moderates the diplomatic tone which is conveyed by Berlin in these days. Let me also emphasize the importance of external trade relations and the role of Germany in this global context. So there are further constraints for Europe's stance. The EU is deeply integrated with the Gulf region as a partner. There were many agreements, many new cooperation fields discovered in the recent years in energy infrastructure investment and also emerging hydrogen markets. Simultaneously, Europe strongly depends on stable international trade corridors, notably the Red Sea and the Suez routes for its Asian imports. Asia is one of the key regions for European imports. So disruptions translate quickly into inflation and an industrial risk. And this is what is basically combined with the lack of energy security we have, which is putting the crisis at a multi-level dimension, not only limiting it to the sphere of energy, but also impacting the overall industrial development. Also notably, we're saying that there is one secure route right now between Asia and Europe, which is the middle corridor going from Turkey via Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the Caspian region to Central Asia and towards Eastern Asia. If you look at the maps, and this is sometimes very helpful for discussing geopolitics, to take a look at the maps. If you look at flight movements, they are all going through Azerbaijan right now, and logistics is also heavily dependent on this corridor. You have Russia in the north, Iran in the south. So the middle corridor is the indispensable route for stabilization of trade and of logistics, and also for energy. So it is very timely that the Trump administration has put the so-called TRIP, Trump Road for International Peace and Prosperity, following the peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And at the same time as we see a destabilization in the GCC region, there is a stabilization in the South Caucasus, which is interconnected from a broader perspective. So these facts and Europe's economic exposure produce a pragmatic balancing act. On the one side, of course, there is a support for Israel's security, while at the same time, there is a serious concern for international humanitarian law and sustained engagement with our Arab partners, reflecting both normative commitments and political interests. It is also worth saying that just 2 days ago, our president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, he mentioned at the 75th anniversary of the reestablishment of the German Foreign Office that the war against Iran is also to condemn following the obligations of international law. And this is a position which is not very popular in Germany, but which I think is right. And once we start to argue with the international law, which Germany has always done, we need to be consequent also in this case. At the European level, especially at the institutional level, fragmentation persists. Divergent national energy mixes, trade dependencies, and domestic politics, also a couple of elections we are facing this year in different EU member states, prevent a unified strategic posture, weakening Europe's geopolitical leverage and its impact as a serious actor with an own agency. So overall, Europe, especially Germany, act currently as a risk-averse economic power, prioritizing crisis containment, energy market stability at a global scale, and continuity and stability of trade, even when this limits a more assertive or unified foreign policy and a more active stance in the region. So this would be my take for the time being. I think we all know that the situation is very dynamic, and the discussion today also can just be a snapshot. It is very difficult to forecast where we will stand even weeks. I'm not even talking about months ahead from today, but I'm very looking forward to the perspectives of my esteemed co-panelists, and looking forward to further engage in the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Unkauf. We will be turning to Professor Marchetti. Given your work on global governance and the evolving role of both state and non-state actors, how do you interpret Europe's response to the current Middle East war? Do you see it primarily as a reflection of internal EU dynamics, or as a part of a broader shift in how international actors engage in crises today?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be here with you today. Let's say that I would say paramount, especially with GCC countries, I think it's the attitude of partnerships. I mean, Europe has partnership with most of the countries in the GCC, partnerships, strategic partnerships. And so there is, I would say, an overall condemnation of the retaliation attacks that Iran launched against GCC countries. So that's, I would say, the overall feeling that of closeness and support for the GCC countries. in general on the conflicts, the ongoing conflicts, Europe has a nuanced position. On the one hand, of course, Europe is an ally of the US, has very strong partnership with Israel. And so Europe is not able to distance itself too much from the US initiative. At the same time, there was a reluctance to join the US, despite Trump demanding European countries to join the action. There is a resistance for a number of reasons that have to do, on the one hand, with the normative arguments. In Europe, there is a clear perception that this war is against international law, i.e., the attack that Israel and the US brought to Iran are not in compliance with international law. At the same time, I would say there is an important concern for not only the energy, but also the trade and logistics dimension of these conflicts. Most of Europe is energy dependent on foreign supply of energy, but also Europe is tightly embedded in global trade. Most of this trade, we know, passes somehow through the Gulf. And there is a very significant concern in the business sector about the raising costs of trade, the prolonged suspension of the trade and logistics in the Gulf. There is also an intense discussion about the insurance component of this. We know that the insurance prices are skyrocketing. And this is something that will last for many weeks, if not months. Already by now, insurance demand and ask and higher prices for any logistics contract that goes through or has sort of some passage in that area. And I'm not talking only about the Persian Gulf, but I'm also talking about the Red Sea. So this means, in practical terms, that trade and logistics in that area is going to be severely degraded for many months ahead. And this has dramatic effects for those countries, of course, for Europe, for the global economy at large. Of course, we know that, and we see that there are ongoing more or less dialogues. Maybe a solution will be found, who knows? But there is also a worse scenario in which a solution is not found, conflicts somehow continue, maybe even escalate. Maybe even Bab el-Mandeb Straits gets closed by Houthis. And then the oil goes skyrocketing at more than $150 per barrel. This is at least the prediction of Standard & Poor's if another 2 weeks of conflicts happen. Well, in that worst case scenario, the situation is very difficult. Of course, first and foremost for GCC countries, for the Emirates, but in general for the world and for Europe. And there is a very serious concern about the economic consequences of this. There is a concern about the military dimension, of course, but then there is also concern about the economic dimension of the conflicts. Another couple of points before I conclude. There is an issue about public opinion. Public opinion tend to be very reluctant and resistant to the idea of Europe getting engaged in this. There is a strong condemnation of the war, despite the fact that at the same time there was a strong condemnation of the repression that took place in the previous months in Tehran and many other Iranian cities against the protesters. So there is a mixed feeling, but the idea, I mean, European public opinion is reluctant to join the war activities with the US. Final point about the implications of this for the war in Ukraine, which is, of course, very important for Europe. We know that the war in Ukraine is partly supplied by Iran. Some of the drones produced and used by Russia are coming from Iran. So, and somehow the war in the Gulf is also interpreted by looking at the war in Ukraine. On the one hand, there is this idea that, okay, maybe this will going to reduce the capabilities of Russia because the supply of Iranian drones will decline. But at the same time, we saw that Russia is somehow profiting a bit from this war in terms of having some restrictions and sanctions lifted by the US on the selling of Russian oil. And so this gives a bit of financial breath to Russia. So my point is that the war in the Gulf in Europe is also perceived in connection to the war in Ukraine. The two are handled somehow together. Okay, thank you very much. I think I stop here for the moment.
Thank you so much, Professor Marchetti. Your insights, I think they added a lot of value to the discussion. Now we're moving on to General Gustino. From a security and defense standpoint, how would you assess Europe's current capacity to respond to the spillover risks of this conflict, particularly in areas such as terrorism, migration, and regional stability?
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. Today, I would like to present an assessment on Europe's position on the ongoing Iran conflict. The key question is not only what is happening now, but how the conflict is evolving and what it means for Europe. Let me begin with a brief strategic outlook explicitly from the European strategic perspective. We can understand the conflict through two core dimensions. First, the degree of strategic control, in other words, whether escalation remains politically controllable or develops its own dynamics. Second, the impact on the political system, whether the conflict stabilizes or destabilizes political orders, especially in Iran and in the wider region. Based on these dimensions, 5 scenarios emerge. First, controlled military confrontation, limited and politically managed use of force. I think we left already this scenario. Second, hybrid confrontation, where the conflict continues below the threshold of full-scale war, dominated by cyber operations, proxies, and political destabilization, and so on. Third, erosion of the Gulf order, a gradual regional destabilization with increasing spillover. Fourth, system breakdown in Iran, internal fragmentation or regime change. And fifth, open regional war, a multi-front escalation with loss of control. Due to time constraints, I cannot elaborate on this more into detail, but you see, I don't really have a positive scenario. Now, where are we today? We are no longer in the phase of controlled military confrontation, although this was obviously planned. Instead, we are in an open transition phase where multiple escalation pathways are simultaneously possible. In the short term, the conflict is driven by escalating military activity and increasing regional spillover. Over time, however, it is most likely to settle into a scenario of hybrid confrontation. I will focus on these 2 scenarios now. Hybrid confrontation does not mean peace. It's obvious that it means that the open military phase may decrease or freeze, but the political consequences of the war remain deep and negative. The conflict continues in a latent form. In parallel, we are likely to see the authoritarian consolidation of Iran with increased repression and reduced willingness of compromise. For Europe, this scenario is particularly challenging. There is no clear end state, no post-war stabilization. Instead, Europe faces a prolonged phase of strategic pressure. Let us now turn into the implications. I will limit myself to two scenarios. In the scenario of hybrid confrontation, Europe faces a complex set of security challenges, including persistent hybrid threats, increased risks of terrorism and sabotage, pressure on critical infrastructure, and growing vulnerability in maritime and energy routes. These pressures are accompanied by economic uncertainty and political polarization within Europe. The core problem is not a single shock, but a continuous process of a long-term strategic erosion. In contrast, the scenario of an open regional war, which what also can happen, would produce a fundamentally different dynamic. Europe would face direct security threats, including potential missile and drone attacks against military bases and critical infrastructure, increased risk of terrorism and sabotage on Europe's soil, and direct military incidents involving European forces. This would be combined with severe disruptions on energy and trade flows, as the professor already mentioned, potential military involvement, and strategic overstretch. This would not be erosion, but acute systemic stress. Before discussing policy options, we must briefly consider Europe's strategic baseline. European territory and infrastructure is already within the range of Iranian missiles and drone systems. At the same time, Europe is economically and politically strained by the Ukraine war, the energy crisis, and internal polarization. Europe currently possesses sufficient capacities to absorb short-term spillover effects in areas such as terrorism and border management, but lacks the coherent power of instruments required to independently prevent broader regional destabilization. As a result, Europe's core interests are clear: avoid direct war involvement, protect its own territory, and maintain credibility in upholding international law. Given this, what options does Europe have? There are three main clusters of action, First, a defensive and protective approach. This focuses on resilience, protection of infrastructure, air and missile defense, maritime security in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, and cyber defense. Increasingly, this also includes forward defense, for example, French and British deployments in the Gulf region. Maritime security operations in the areas such as Red Sea or Strait of Hormuz are key example. They are formally defensive, but operationally close to escalation as they involve direct interaction with Iranian forces or proxies. In counterterrorism, Europe is relatively well positioned. Europe is capable of detecting and often preventing elevated terrorist risks. The main weakness does not lie in a lack of institution, but in the nature of the threat itself. Low threshold, digitally radicalized, and hard to predict forms of attacks. Therefore, Europe's capacity in this area is high, but not fully preventive. Europe's operational migration capacity is stronger than in 2015, but its political resilience remains low. The EU is better able to manage sudden surges in pressure, but prolonged or larger scale displacement movements would quickly reactive alter distribution conflicts, capacity bottlenecks in reception systems, and domestic political polarization. I skip now the diplomacy issue because Europe is not really an actor in the field of diplomacy. At this point, we must be clear about Europe's limitations. Europe's military capabilities are fragmented. There is significant dependence on the United States, particularly in intelligence, logistics, and missile defense. Power projection is limited. Decision-making is very slow, and domestic support for coalition is low, not to say not existing. In addition, Europe faces multiple simultaneous challenges, especially due to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Across the scenarios, and especially in the most likely one, Europe acts primarily as a reactive actor with limited ability to shape the conflict strategically. In the event of a regional war, Europe would be drawn into deeper involvement, but under conditions of high dependency on the United States and NATO structures, with limited control over escalation. As a result, Europe cannot rely on influencing the trajectory of the conflict. Instead, it must prepare for several scenarios simultaneously. The core strategic task is therefore not to manage the conflict itself, but to manage its spillover effects. This includes first preparing for renewed migration pressures and potential secondary displacement dynamics. Second, strengthening protection against terrorism and hybrid attacks on European soil. And third, and finally, and most critically, managing the economic and political consequences of energy disruptions and sustained price volatility. In other words, Europe's challenge is not to control the conflict, but to absorb its consequences. Thank you very much. I tried to be brief. Could you hear me?
Thank you, General Orsino. It was just lagging the last sentence. Would you mind repeating it?
Yes. Europe's challenge is not to control the conflict.
Just the last sentence. Yeah.
Yeah. Europe's challenge is not to control the conflict, but to absorb its consequences. That was my last sentence. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, General. Thank you for your detailed predictions. I think they offer a really insightful look at what may lie ahead. I will move on to Mr. Strubont. There are growing indications that decision-making within Iran has become more fragmented following recent leadership losses. How does this affect the trajectory of the conflict? And does this make the crisis inherently harder for the EU to manage, given its reliance on consensus and slower decision-making cycles?
Well, thank you very much for having me again. It's always a pleasure collaborating with you at Trends, and I think this strategic dialogue comes at a very timely moment in the current crisis. So really happy to be part of this. Great question. First of all, when we look at the leadership losses of Ayatollah Khamenei, Larijani, senior IGC figures, and others, well, this has removed the key intermediaries to which were able to translate the battlefield realities into political strategy, pushing actually the system towards more fragmented, more reactive, and also more security-dominated decision-making, rather than kind of a coherent, calibrated conflict management. The death of the Ayatollah Khamenei means that although the regime is not collapsing at the moment, well, wartime governance becomes more disorganized, more tilting towards the IGC, which is basically having an internal struggle also for power into the regime and in Tehran. And we also see that this is producing less flexible military and political endgame possibilities. Therefore, we see a likelihood of escalatory moves before any return to negotiations. So I would say making sure that your position at the negotiation table is a very strong position, and that's not the case at the moment. Fragmentation at the center is also compounded by a proxy network and also this narrative of martyrdom that can generate retaliation independently from what's decided at central control. So we see these proxies, lone wolf actors, cyber units, terrorists, useful idiots in Europe, which have already committed attacks. So we see that the overall trajectory is less predictable and also potentially harder to turn off by the central command or the central leadership, which might be seeking this escalation, while others are independently creating mayhem, whatever they are. So in this context, we see that regime survival, rather than strategic victory, defines a success for Tehran, and that is favoring aggressive high-tempo retaliation, like these ballistic missiles, strike on energy infrastructure, regional US assets. And this is designed to raise the pain threshold of adversaries, even at the cost of undoing previous regional rapprochement and basically also destroy any ties Iran could have in the region. So it's almost a nothing to lose scenario that we are seeing at the moment. Eventually, we should also not forget that military operations as such are currently shaping the evolution of the conflict, and not only what's happening in one of the capitals. We see a high attrition level on Iranian political, military, but also critical infrastructure potential, forcing Iran to choose for more selected or selective high-impact operations like and also targeting energy infrastructure like the LNG terminal in Qatar, but also in other countries in the region. And we saw all see this pressure and the constant strikes on maritime routes in the region also. So this is again pushing the USA to review part of the maybe strategic or definitely operational planning and shift to the potential use of specialized or special operations on the ground, putting boots on the ground, but in a very specific way, with very specific assets in very specific locations. What we're also facing is basically the new leaders. So those are more, I would say, less experienced figures, mostly from the IRGC. And it's also unclear at the moment who is really in charge. There is an internal struggle going on there for power in Tehran also. So who will be the interlocutors for negotiations? Will those people be acceptable to both Israel and the USA, or will the killing of those people continue until we reach that level which would be acceptable also? We also need to take into account that Israel and the USA have a different view on what a regime change in Iran would look like, where Israel would look to basically eradicate the regime of the mullahs and the IRGC, which is, I think, most unlikely, and maybe bet on Reza Pahlavi to be transition figures leading to a more pro-Israel and pro-Western Iran in the future. While on the other hand, the USA would be ready to settle for a more moderated Mullah and IRGC regime, which they could, of course, manipulate politically and economically. As it was already the case before the conflict, we also look at the fragmented opposition, reaching from Russia-backed communists to royalists to, I would say, more moderate religious leaders. So that also makes the perspective of pro-Western and pro-Israel regime change more diffuse and really unlikely to happen. And I'm not even talking about these demographic and geographic, I would say, changes or differences within the country also. We also need to remind ourselves that at the grand strategy level, so when we elevate ourselves to that level, we cannot forget the perception and influence from both Beijing and Moscow, which eventually are also the grand strategic political targets of this conflict. So now if we look at the EU and their capability to manage, well, this more fragmented, security-driven and proxy-diffuse Iranian decision-making environment makes the crisis structurally harder for the EU to manage, because European influence in the Middle East is already in decline or has already declined in the past. And the Union has also largely been sidelined both from military and diplomatic center stage in this conflict and many other conflicts in the world, even the conflict on European soil in Ukraine. Actually, it has been, as I said, sidelined from any conflict or any development in international security in the past years. The current reality in international relations and international security is revolving around a very aggressive, competitive, and transactional, I would even say mercantile form of offensive realism, which is counterintuitive for Europeans and the EU as such. So this approach is concentrating on the use of relative power, including the use of force, so the military power, to steer international relations and influence international security. That's actually the Achilles heel for the EU and many European countries, unable to develop any power to become relevant or influential, or to remain relevant and influential. Even though Europe as such can be considered as very well integrated and part of the international system, it's 500 million people, it's a full continent, it's a third economic power in the world and second to third military power in the world also. Well, it's unable to turn that into power because of the lack of strategic outlook, strategic vision and strategy as such on one hand, and also the political will to implement such strategy. We also see that Europe is polarized politically, and that it's weakening Europe also. It's weakened by internal ideological and political struggles and opposition between left and far left ideas on one hand, and more right and extreme right wing vision on the other hand, sometimes leading to national interests being undermined or coalition governments to be neutralized. The war against Iran is unsettling for Europeans in, I think, three ways. And we always need to keep in mind that there is a huge difference between the EU 27 on one hand and the 27 member states of the EU on the other hand. Those are two different concepts, right? So the first weight is unsettling for the Europeans, but it's dividing them. We see on one hand Spain, which is condemning the war as illegal under international law, while Germany chooses more to support its American and Israeli allies, even though international law remains a huge idea and I would say a huge topic within Europe also. And we can debate if international law and international organizations are still part of the current international system or at the basis of the current international realist system also. What I see is that each member state is actually pursuing their own interest, taking into account the risks that they are facing. And there is also a traditional geographic division within the EU or Europe, where the eastern Baltic and northern flank is looking more towards Russia, while the western flank and the southern flank are looking more towards, I would say, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea. Well, clearly there, the second way, it's unsettling for Europe. It's also distracting them for Ukraine, which should be their priority right now, as it has been said before. We also see that the Americans are increasingly preoccupied by other sectors, other locations in the world. And, you know, this is also generating reflections within Europe, like, for example, my own prime minister in Belgium, urging for peace in Ukraine and also the start of negotiation with Russia, of course, facing certain backlash at EU level. But I think what he's asking for is to end this conflict in Europe. And it's a conflict in which Europe is paying a lot of money, but is doing this without neither strategic nor political influence in the conflict. We pay a lot of money for this conflict, but we are not influencing the conflict. And the third unsettling part is, I think, Europe is both afraid of being dragged into the war and also shocked by the attitude of the United States by, first of all, openly breaking international law, but also continuously degrading its relationship and alliance with Europe. We have seen quite a lot of harsh words and even insults flowing from the United States to Europe in the past weeks and the past months also. The EU's consensus-bound and legally constrained decision cycles, I mean, you mentioned it, Shamsa, combined with this limited hard power leverage and its loss of status as a trusted mediator, mean that it struggles to translate its economic weight, the statements and the conditionality into real shaping power over Iranian choices or US-Israeli operational tempo. The member states share a broad objective of avoiding entanglement. I mean, Gustav Gustenau has said it before. This idea of this is not a war and the priority to Ukraine, which creates an inbuilt caution that limits the EU's readiness to assume new military and security roles, like, for example, in the Red Sea or the Strait of Hormuz, exactly when the conflict's fragmentation would require more agile and strategically committed engagement, so a faster decision-making and I would say, a harder way of intervening. Personally, I don't think that this is not a war argument is a valid argument. Any EU risk analysis would highlight that the only but massive strategic risk to the EU is energy security. And even in times today in Europe of rearmament, I think I always say we need to reinstall the European Community of Steel and Coal, but not to manage the production of military assets, but to find steel and to find coal. We need to find energy for industry to be able also to produce this equipment for Europe also there. So I don't think that this argument of this is not a war is a valid argument, especially now that Iran is putting pressure on the world's economic jugular, which is so important for us in Europe also. So European governments and the EU needs to add this on their radar, and they need to become influential there also, as they have been in the past. The current events are also happening at the moment, of course, in which EU is reinventing itself as a possible security actor, developing a sort of security mindset at the same time, and massively investing in the development of its military capabilities, resilience, but also strategic autonomy. So in conclusion, I would say that from a risk analysis and crisis management perspective, Europe's preparedness appears asymmetric. And the asymmetry lies in the fact that analytically, we have identified the main escalation vectors. Gustav Gustenau spoke about the potential scenarios. So Iranian survival logic, proxy activation, cyber retaliation, energy shocks, migration risk, terrorism, this kind of stuff. But institutionally and politically, our capacity to act on these risks remain constrained and very reactive. So we see what's happening. We see what we would need to do, but it's very difficult for us to act actually. On energy and economic fallout, I think the EU leaders have moved relatively quickly to acknowledge the vulnerability. This has been known for 20 years and more, that energy insecurity is one of the major risks. What we also see that they shifted or they accelerated the energy transition and then asked for emergency measures on prices, on energy prices. But this common line actually masks a very deep internal division over instruments and also reveals the broader pattern of consensus you spoke about, Shamsa, or the facade of consensus in which unity or diagnosis does not automatically translate into decisive implementation. So in security and foreign policy terms, the greater challenge lies less in anticipating escalation, which analysts, think tanks and institutions already describe in detail, and more in acting effectively. I already said that before. I think that's something which is really important. We see what we need to do. We know what we need to do, but it's very difficult for us to do that. So military, very dependent on the US, it has been said, strategically hesitant in the Middle East and politically torn between legal normative reflexes, or intuition, and the counterintuitive, the need to a more hard power environment and the need to control that also. So the war in Iran, or the Iran war, exposes a very structural gap between Europe's risk awareness and its ability to convert that awareness into coherent, timely crisis action. As long as defense dependence, internal fragmentation, and the primacy of other theaters like Ukraine persist, European responses will likely remain cautious, incremental, and largely focused on damage limitation rather than genuine conflict shaping. As said, thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shrubant. I have one more question directed towards you and General Gustav. It will be a concluding question. If Europe is to move from reacting to crisis to shaping outcomes, what do you think is one key change or a few key changes, political, strategic, economic, that you believe is most necessary?
I will go first and then leave the floor to General Gustav afterwards, if that's okay with you, Shamsa. I think, in a few words, it's exactly what I explained in my presentation also. I think you need to understand the game in which you play. You need to know their rules and play by the rules. And that's something we're not really doing in Europe at the moment. We kind of still stuck into the previous liberal world, the liberal approach to international relations, where international law is central. And I think it's a good thing. But we also need to acknowledge that the world has changed. And we are now in a different world where this could be seen as weakness rather than the hard power that you need to intervene. So I would say, analyze the game, know the rules, play the game by the rules, and make the effort to come up with a strategy and a political will to implement this. Develop some power to gain your seat back at the negotiation table and become influential again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. General Gustav?
Yes, I can, to some extent, also follow the presentation of Serge. What Europe needs to develop the ability to act as a coherent strategic actor. It's not a certain capacity. This is a core capacity. It's the ability to act as a coherent strategic actor, meaning to act faster, more unified, and a clear political decision-making process in an external crisis. Right now, Europe's main limitations is not a lack of resources. It has economic weight, as Serge also elaborated. It has regulatory power, and even military. It has also relevant military capabilities. The core problem is fragmentation. Foreign and security policy is still largely driven by unanimity or fragile consensus. Member states prioritize national risk perceptions, Eastern versus Southern focus. Crisis response is therefore slow, reactive, and often lowest common denominator. As a result, Europeans can absorb shocks, migration, terrorism, energy, and disruptions, but it struggles to shape the environment that produces those shocks. I think that's all what one can say at the moment.
Thank you so much, General Agostino. And thank you all for being here. It was a pleasure to moderate this session and listen to your wonderful insights. And we'll hope to see you again soon for more dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator and distinguished speakers for engaging in a thought-provoking discussion. Before we move on to our second panel, we kindly request that all the panelists keep their cameras on throughout the panel. The second panel is titled Energy, Geopolitics, and Gulf Security, Europe's Expanding Commitments. This session will focus on the intersection of energy, security, geopolitical shifts, and Europe's evolving role in the Gulf region. As the crisis unfolds, Europe's engagement in energy markets and regional stability is becoming increasingly significant, raising important questions about the long-term commitments and the strategic priorities. Moderating this discussion is Hamdan Al-Hamadi, researcher at Trends Research and Advisory. Hamdan, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining panel 2. My name is Hamdan Hamadi, and I am a researcher at Trends Research and Advisory. It is a pleasure to moderate this session today. We are pleased to have with us today Mr. Manfredi Ballerini, who is a scientific coordinator at CISS, LUISS University at Rome, and Mr. Alberto Rizzi, who is a policy fellow at ECFR Rome, Mr. Mustafa Al-Ammar, who is a member of the National Security Council of a ruling Germany party, and Mr. Bernard Siman, who is a senior associate fellow at the Egmont Institute in Belgium. So without further ado, let's begin with our first speaker. I'll be asking 2 questions, and I'll be giving you guys, our speakers, 10 minutes to respond to the questions. So Mr. Ballerini, how well can Europe handle the security risks in the Gulf without overstretching itself? And the second question is, what are the main challenges preventing Europe from having one clear strategy on Gulf security? The floor is yours.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me and from this initiative that, as also in the previous panel was said, is indeed coming at a very timely, in a very timely moment. So that's questions that people are asking with a very high rate in Europe right now. So, of course, the crisis is to a certain extent something that Europe didn't want. It doesn't come at the moment in which Europe was ready. And we see that also in the fact that Europe is not, at least somehow is not taking active part into the operations, into the US initiative in itself. Of course, this is not the only reason why Europe is not taking part and taking sides into this conflict, at least formally, although we know that informally, the US are indeed using the basis of a series of strategic allies in the region to conduct operations in the Middle East right now. But this comes as, if we intend the system as a multi-crisis system that the EU is currently facing, well, this was another additional crisis that the Europe was probably not ready to manage in the short run. Europe is facing a huge challenge, military challenge, defense and security challenge, and energy challenge for a series of years now. That is indeed the crisis in Ukraine. And it was somehow finding a framework to deal with that. And recently with the Trump's election, also that front started to somehow have to be rethought strategically on the side of the EU leadership. And we also saw that there were some difficulties from an inside perspective in terms of support from people when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was another challenge in which Europe already started to have problem to justify a certain strategic positioning in foreign policy terms, especially as far as certain countries within Europe were concerned, to what many people started asking in terms of civil society, for instance. A clear example of that is Italy, where the position of the government was pretty much online, although trying to distance themselves from certain action conducted by the Israeli government, while the internal consent of the parties, of the governing parties, was somehow diminishing on that specific issue. Once that situation seemed to be somehow pacified, at least on the short term, well, then US initiative once again started to ignite the region without taking into account, at least that's something that we came to know in the immediate aftermath of the military initiative, without really consulting the European leadership, which at a certain point had to once again react to something that was happening geopolitically in a crucial region and on crucial issues that directly affected. So Europe needs to find its own position, but at the same time, it has to understand whether or not it wants to intervene into the crisis and try to deal with those issues that the crisis is bringing to Europe directly. So one thing that I would say is indeed the fact that we have, as Europe, maybe not as much as Asia or specific Asian countries, a huge dependency in terms of resources, which is also part of the things I think we are going to discuss during this panel. The idea being that we are not controlling the crisis. There are certain initiatives to somehow promote negotiation channels and diplomatic channels to manage the crisis, but currently, at least to what we know from open source information, well, there are not actively any steps towards like a central European role into the negotiations. So Europe is passively receiving the effects of a certain crisis. Now, not to be too pessimistic, there are indeed certain spaces of opportunity for Europe right now, which is strengthening its relationship with the Gulf countries that are not directly involved into the conflict and trying to strengthen partnership and provide, I've seen that again, I bring the example of Italy, that is understanding how to support its allies in the region, its partners in the region, also from a defensive perspective. Now, of course, if we bring this back to the security situation in Europe, this is, to come to your question, it could be an overstretch. Europe was somehow managing its furniture or its provision of defensive instruments and weapons to Ukraine, but we're ready to have discussions about how sustainable that could have been without the US support. Now, adding another front, the US is probably capable of fighting wars on multiple fronts. We don't know if Europe is capable of fighting on one front. It's very hard for them to fight on multiple fronts. So the current capacity of European countries to act is probably limited by physical constraints and by resources. Now, that, of course, that is a material challenge for Europe in itself. But then, of course, there is the broader issue for Europe looking at this crisis is the US still a partner? Is it still a reliable strategic partner? Because today you see somebody on which you depend from a defensive perspective still, although Europe is investing a lot in defense and probably the direction would be in 5, 10, 15 years to be more independent from the US. Still, we are dependent from the US for our defense. We can, of course, at a good cost, because all the money you save on defense, you can invest in something else internally. That has been a compromise that we have gladly accepted after the Ukraine crisis. But now we are seeing that this dependency, well, Trump is asking a price for this dependency. And it's not only a monetary price in terms of spending more for defense, it is also a strategic geopolitical price, which is the US take action and then Europe has to react. With all its issues, so far I've been speaking about Europe mostly as a united entity, Of course, if we then delve into the political issues within Europe itself, it's not only all these challenges, but there is an additional challenge that is the divergent objectives and preferences of single member states. That it's something more that adds a layer of complexity to understanding where Europe is going and where it will go. I have to say that from what we have seen so far, this specific crisis seems to have somehow strengthened, or at least we can see a convergence among the main actors involved in EU leadership. So we see France, Germany, Italy that somehow seems to have, at least for the moment, a certain common plan to tackle or to try to intervene into the situation. Spain is an outlier currently, but that is, so far, it's not affecting as deep as it could be the general EU positioning. Everything said so far will, of course, depend also on how long the crisis will go and whether or not this will be unsustainable for a European perspective in terms of energy crisis, in terms of justifications to the US intervention, and so on. So, I mean, this, I hope, kind of, this is a little bit how I see and how it seems to be from a European perspective, these difficulties in tackling the, once again, challenge and crisis opening up in the last 5 years. And although we are seeing this kind of convergence so far, that could be challenging the next times if the conflict is prolonged.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ballerini, for your valuable insight. We will now move to our second speaker, Mr. Ritzi. Thank you for being with us. The questions are, how do disagreements between European countries affect the European Union's response to the crisis? And the second question is, can Europe play a strong diplomatic role in the Gulf? What would it need to do so? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll try to give you an understanding of how I see the persistent division among European countries, but more specifically, I'd like to look at the three different layers of division that have emerged. And the first one is in terms of foreign policy, and it is related to the alignment that different European countries have. And although the previous speaker already expressed how there's some sort of convergence among major European players that kind of coalesces around 2 points. The first one is a refusal to take an active part into the war while concentrating only on defensive postures. The other one is to call for a de-escalation and to push both sides as much as it is possible towards diplomacy and negotiation instead of escalating further the conflict. And this also stems from a European worry that there is a significant risk of an extension of the conflict. And however, despite this convergence, we still have quite significant differences, mostly related to where major European players align. And we have seen countries that are more closely associated with Washington, both in terms of ideological position, but also in terms of pure foreign policy engagement, especially Italy and Germany signing closer to the US position and in generally supporting, although indirectly through the use of bases, the ongoing conflict, and also refusing to directly condemn the attack and the conflict, while we have France, which is a sort of a middle player, which has stressed its own independence in action, has deployed defensive assets, but with a clear focus on the defensive side, and then so far restrained from engaging more directly into the war. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, in a way, we do have Spain, which has condemned the conflict from the very beginning, have refused to be associated in any way with that. And it's been still a minority position within the European position, but some countries have moved slightly closer in terms of defining the US attack against Iran as an illegal move, something that does not respect major points of international law, while at the same time also condemning strongly Iran's escalation, and in particular Iran responses in terms of attacking neighboring countries and European military bases across the region. Italy, the UK, France have all been subject to reprisals attacks by Iran. And however, this major distance prevents in the first instance, European from adopting a common voice, and the second point, it creates this fragmented communication that also creates a lot of confusion in the partners in the region and beyond, because it's very unclear where does Europe stand in relation to this crisis. On top of this, we do also see a growing rift between governments and public opinion. So this domestic policy front, which is particularly problematic, especially in countries that have aligned more closely with the United States, simply because to the vast majority of European population, regardless of where they live and which political position they have, this conflict is extremely unpopular. Especially because of the economic consequences, but generally there is no understanding, no desire by public opinion in European countries to be part of this conflict. And this in turn creates an additional degree of difficulty because it limits politically the avenues that governments have to engage in the conflict. And we've seen already some sort of expression of disagreement with government policies or against those governments that are perceived as not taking a strong enough position towards the conflict. And finally, we do have another layer of division, which is related mostly to threat perception. Although there is a shared opinion that Iran has been a problematic actor in the region, there is a massive difference between those countries that are most exposed to potential spillover of the conflict, especially in the Mediterranean region and in Europe's southern flank. Italy is a player in this, but there's also Greece, Cyprus, which has witnessed attacks on US base hosted on its territory, and the countries mostly located in the northern and eastern flank that have only perceived Iran as a threat in relation to Iran's role in supplying weapons to Russia in its war against Ukraine, but for any other reason do not see Iran as any sort of direct threat, and are particularly worried about the fact that any missile defense asset, any engagement that is being deployed to the region is something that is less available to Ukraine. And here I think the most significant case is the one represented by Poland, because Poland, although it has been one of the governments most closely aligned with the United States and generally traditionally is a country that is a staunch defender of the transatlantic alliance, has expressed a total refusal to engage with the US on the conflict, refused to let any of its bases being used, by claiming that they do not have any assets that would be useful to the United States. And there's very strongly remarked that any attention that is diverted from Ukraine is a significant danger for the security of Poland and of Europe in the southern flank. And so this division creates primarily a problem in terms of willingness of countries to engage, and especially in order to deploy any potential assets to a region that for some is of particular concern, but for others is a totally secondary theater of conflict compared to the main one. And Poland's president, which is a close ally of US President Trump, has also said very recently that the existential issue for Poland is the Ukraine war and not any other conflict. And to come to your second question, I would say that Europeans would have to be realistic in this. And they do. They can play a role, but only if they are extremely realistic in the fact they cannot play a major diplomatic role into the conflict. This is not a war that touches European security, touches European energy security. On the other hand, it has been already proven to be disastrous in terms of the economic consequences for the conflict, and this is something that is symmetrical regardless of the stance that the governments do have. But at the same time, Europeans have to recognize that they have only limited assets they can dedicate to the region. They have only limited leverage in their engagement with the United States as well as with Gulf partners, so they would have to be realistic in terms of what they can achieve. And what they can achieve is basically trying to form a unitary bloc, engage Gulf partners from a single standpoint instead of a cluster of completely different voices, and trying to understand which kind of assistance they can realistically provide in short term on the one side, and on the other one, which channels they do still have to push for a diplomatic engagement between the different sides. Anything beyond this, I would say, is not something that is achievable from Europe, and pursuing any sort of grander scheme would subtract precious resources that can be dedicated specifically to where Europe can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rizzi, for those important points. Let us move now to our third speaker, Mr. Al-Ammar. Thank you for joining us today. The questions are, how is Germany balancing domestic political pressure with its commitment to Gulf partners and the NATO allies? And the second question is, what role can Germany play in supporting Europe's energy and security effort in the Gulf? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Hamdan. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon for the Emirates and good morning for Europe. Well, to answer your question, Hamdan, it's a very critical time for us, not only for the GCC, not only for the region, because it's the global issue right now. It's not only it's your issue. And about the domestic politics caution right now, we are facing a huge challenge because, first of all, we're having a new government. As I am a member of the national security, we took the responsibility since less than a year, since last year in May, and now we are facing a lot of issues. And those issues we need to prepare. First of all, as all the previous guests here just highlight, we're having the biggest challenge is the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and this is also something that we change our strategy, we change our defense strategy. We're investing a lot now in the defense, and this is maybe the most focusing point that what we are just having right now. And what we need right now to answer your question is that we need to have a clear dialogue. We need also to explain to our actors in the Democrats actors. We sure we have very far left and very far right, and this is very hard to communicate with them because they have their ideology. But I think we still having the ability and are able and capable to engage more, even in the domestic, and even not only in Germany but also as a Europe, to act as a one person. And what you say that about the energy, and this is absolute against our system right now, our economy, because especially if we back now to February, when also the UAE take a big part there in the Munich conference, security conference. It's been signing a lot of agreement between ADNOC and between Germany to establish a partnership. This partnership was not being able to realize since many governments in the previous. And we just start now a good communication. We just start now a good strategy. We just start now our new turning point in the economy or the geo-economic. And I think we could keep this bridge. We just built the bridge between Berlin and the GCC countries. And we need this bridge to stay stable and stronger. So let me back now about our topic today. So to go much deeply, we just had yesterday a very deep conversation in our board, and our national security board as a ruling party and the CDU here in Berlin. And today I left the office because there is a demonstration in front of the office. So I left the office to be here now, so to talk much freely. So we highlight many points, and we're having today a very latest news from our German, let's say the defense minister. He said that Germany is prepared to support effort to secure a ceasefire and strongly support a diplomatic solution as quick as possible. This is also reflects a very clear approach and also support the region. And I saw that also our foreign minister, Vodafone, was in the region 2 weeks ago. He met also with the foreign minister, Abdullah Nahyan in Abu Dhabi, and he went also to the region, to Qatar and to many countries, which that's also he met here often with the ambassador of the UAE and the GCC countries and with Jordan. And that's show that we are not hiding. We are taking the responsibility. We are joining to have a solution. But many been asking, even I spoke about that yesterday in our session in our board in this national security, many asking why Germany is not taking a serious act in this conflict by the military or in defense, at least like the last two years when the Farkata from Germany went to the Red Sea. Well, I think even the previous experts been explaining that We are a parliamentary military. We are not allowed to take any decision that's been through one party or through the decision maker here, president or the chancellor. We cannot move any soldier to put outside without having the mandate from the parliament. And this is a very serious act because we don't want even to have the same scenario from Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. And more than that, United States or the American administration haven't been involved us in this strategy. And as we are a member of the NATO and we are investing now in the NATO and we are increase our investing now in the NATO, increase in the defense, we haven't been taking a very serious role in that because nobody asked us to join or even about our opinion, and even not being, I would say that including the GCC countries about this war. So this war has been made by the America, as the chancellor said, this is not our war, but doesn't mean that's not our responsibility. We need to support more. We need now more dialogue. We don't need now actually just to listen. We need to act. And I think now we're having now the ability even to communicate much better because this is the critical turning point, not only for Germany. This is also the United Arab Emirates facing that because for a long time, United Arab Emirates been the strong role model in sustainability, in peace, in development, in many things. Even I'm almost every 2 months in the UAE, building this bridge between Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all the GCC countries, because we need a very good communication, because without communication, we cannot reach very well. And I think our chancellor in the last visit to the UAE and to the region, he made it very clear. It's not about economy. It's not about win-win situation. As I say, this is the threat of the mullahs. The threat of the mullahs been for many, many decades. And now we are not facing a classical war. Now we are facing a radical ideology. This radical ideology will not be end by getting mullah away from the battlefield. There is a waiting list. You have a lot of arms of Iran. Houthis, you have Hezbollah, you have Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, you have many countries. Lebanon is still open, many also in Yemen, many also in different countries around the world. So you need, first of all, to close those channels and then to work not from outside, to work from inside to support even those people who's really suffering in Iran since many, many years. Even I born in Iraq, we've been suffering a lot from Iran since we are children. So now the scenario is coming back because since the 1990, since the end of the 70s until today, this region was always on fire. And this is not going to be end by this administration from the United States. This is going to be a very big and huge scar in the all geopolitics in the region after maybe for many, many also administration. So I think now we need to unify it. We need to have much work together. Germany could support, back to this point, Germany could support more in defense. We have a very strong know-how. The previous experts also say we are 400 million. Even the chancellor, they say that we are 400 million, so like Canada and America, so we are not only the continent, but we could produce our defense. We have the know-how. And we're having now, starting since the 4 years, the war when it started against Ukraine, we're having now rebuild our military. Now we are investing more in the defense, and now we're having much clear view what our future going to be. And this, I think, also we can work together with the GCC defense sector. And today is all about technology. Today is not anymore, this is the classical war going to go with the troops, like in Iraq, like in Afghanistan. We are now facing a very high threat, cyber threat and sabotage, terrorism, immigrations. So all those files or all those points never been highlighted, never been negotiated with the European before starting this war. And to close this point, I also highlight some points, but I went just frankly and spoke about that. All the actors here in Germany in the politics, from the chancellor down to the members of the ruling party, and so they are staying with you. They are supporting UAE, supporting GCC. We need the GCC. We need the United Arab Emirates because this is the leader of the tolerance. They're having more than 200 nationalities in the country. It was never been working like this. This is the role model of the of the integration. We still having problems here with several international citizens. We cannot have a great integration like in the UAE. Plus, we are also want to say to you and to support you. Keep Abraham upcoming, that is going to live more longer, and I hope we're not going to be end because of this conflict. No, I think this is the time is testing for our partnership. This is an examination, but we need to stick together to find a good solution, and we're going to get back and much stronger. Thank you very much.
Wa alaikum assalam, and thank you very much, Mr. Al-Haman, for those important points. We will now move to our final speaker, Mr. Siman. Thank you for being with us today. The questions are, how would you describe the EU's response to the war so far? Has Europe been united, or are there still clear differences between member states? The second question is, how is misinformation or foreign influence affecting how Europeans see this conflict? And is the European Union doing enough to respond to that? The floor is yours, and thank you. Do we still have Mr. Siman on board? Oh. As we're waiting for Mr. Siman to come back, we have some time for anyone to give out any additional points or feedback or insights that they would like to give if they didn't have the time to.
I just want to add one thing more, if I may, Brother Hamdan.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I think some of the experts used to say that Europe or Germany haven't been able to make more diplomacy. This is different point, because we've been in the last few months, we've been engaging the diplomacy. If anyone remember that the E3, UK, Germany, and France, being how would say that, working very hard to bring the Iranian to the table, but even they refuse to have a clear conversation, and that's why we use the snapback. Even it was the first time in our history, even in Europe, to list the Al-Haras al-Thawri on the blacklist of the terrorists of the European. So we are working it and we are moving, but we need to have our unity much stronger. That was the point that I just would like to highlight. Thank you.
Really appreciate your insight, Mr. Al-Haman. I think Mr. Siman is back. Can you hear us, Mr. Siman?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes. Were you able to hear the questions? Then go ahead, or should I repeat the question?
Yes, no, I heard your questions. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. If you hear a bit of noise behind me, it's because I am at the French Military Academy, and I am in an area where various people are congregating. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay. Well, the response of the EU institutions, of course, as distinct from the individual member states, has also been varied. So the European Commission and the voice of the president of the commission initially was quite supportive of the operations in the Gulf, whereas the European External Action Service, which is the diplomatic arm of the European institutions, and Ms. Callas, the High Commissioner and Vice President, met, in fact, Gulf foreign ministers, emphasized de-escalation, or rather breaking of the escalation cycle. But I think the more interesting and less reported position was that of the European Council, where all 27 member states gather. And the European Council was very nuanced and unified in its response, emphasizing 4 principles. 1, breaking the escalation cycle. 2, respect for international law. No attack, thirdly, on civilian infrastructure and the protection of civilians. And in that position, the 27 member states managed to find a common ground. But interestingly, of course, is the as many of my colleagues, the speakers mentioned, the split in positions between, on one end, the Spanish clear objection to the war at all, and then you have the more nuanced German and French positions. In my view, the French position is in fact the most powerful and most interesting, because the President of the Republic, President Macron, very clearly articulated that France, and therefore, in his view, Europe must act within the framework of the United Nations, and that France will act together with the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, with the principle of respect for international law at the heart of its approach. Now, this is very important, because if you look at the composition of the Security Council, of course, the permanent members include China. And therefore, does that mean that a potential European approach led by France will include coordination and consultation with China on finding de-escalation and diplomatic resolution within the framework of the United Nations Charter? So that is insofar as the European institutions and the member state positions are. I think in the next weeks, we will see an acceleration of the French role potentially in formulating and coordinating a European response, whether it is in the question of escorting ships through the Straits of Hormuz, or whether it is in demining operations, as well as the broader questions of energy security and the geopolitical dimension to the conflict. In terms of disinformation and misinformation, the European Union terminology, official terminology, is FIMI, which stands for Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference. And the EU has been quite effective, in fact, in countering FIMI. However, the current concerns around FIMI center around narratives as well as disinformation. Narratives that aim at undermining trust in the European institutions, undermining trust in decisions taken by individual member states and governments, undermining trust in international law, and to by doing so to encourage divisions domestically in the different member states, and weakening through manipulating public opinion, weakening support for the military. is, of course, that the member states and the EU are concerned about, specifically because of the war in Iran, is disinformation and FEMI in the area of radicalization, misusing the current events in order to enhance radicalization efforts. Technology, of course, plays a key role in this. And the key area of concern is the AI-enabled micro-targeting. AI-enabled micro-targeting, of course, enables targeting the same type of narrative delivered differently and with different packaging to different individuals and different groups. And that is a very serious rising threat within the FEMI universe. In terms of countering FEMI, one of the key achievements of the Belgian presidency of the European Council last year was to use a very specific mechanism called the Integrated Political Crisis Response Mechanism to enable coordination between the different member states on the exchange of data and information in the area of cybersecurity and disinformation by partially triggering the mechanism rather than having to trigger the whole mechanism. The lead to this was the European elections last year, where there were concerns that FEMI and disinformation, cyber operations will undermine the integrity of the elections. And I must say the European Union was extremely successful, in fact, in deterring many of these activities, mitigating the risk arising from that through the use of this collective mechanism across the European Union. Of course, the challenges are great and huge. They remain. So to conclude, on the first part, I think we should look out for a more proactive European response within the framework of the United Nations. And in terms of FEMI, I think we will see potentially the use of the integrated political crisis response mechanism across the 27 in order to exchange data and information to counter the threats posed by radicalization in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Siman, for those important points. I would like to thank everyone for participating and for their valuable contribution and thoughtful insight. Before ending, does anyone want to add anything or insight before concluding our panel?
I just would like to highlight one point more, Hamdan, because I think this is also very important, also for our experts and our colleagues. And the GCC is not about the GCC. In the GCC, living more than 1 million European citizens. When we talk here and when we discuss about our strategy against the Russian aggression and the Ukraine, we say we have to protect Moldova. Why? Because there is also hundreds of thousands of Romanians, they are living there. So now this is also a part of our responsibility also to move and also to focus on this region, to invest more, not only maybe investing by the cooperation, but also to investing, as the previous experts say, maybe with the data room. That means that we have much flexibility with exchange data. This is also much important for right now. Disinformation, fake news, what we are seeing now about the TikTok, whatever, and so on. We don't have that stronger law as the UAE. UAE is very strict with such things, but we need also to change our law here or to make it much stronger, so which can matching with our development or with the new world, what we are living right now. It's not anymore a classic war. We are facing now a big challenge, and I think we need to also be able and capable to be on the same level. Thank you very much for the invitation, and all the best for the UAE, for the GCC, and see you soon in the UAE. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much, Mr. Mustafa Al-Ammar. And thank you to all of our speakers. We appreciate your input. And thank you all.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
صوتي واضح؟
نعم.
Hi everyone. I would like sincerely to appreciate every one of you for participating in our third strategic dialogue on the war in the Middle East and to see how Europe sees this crisis. We have developed concluding remarks and also some recommendation, and I would like to read it out loud to you. The war has quickly become a multi-level crisis for Europe, impacting its energy security, economy, politics, as well as potentially generating future threats. Europe's division on the war has three different layers: the foreign policy element and countries' alignment with the US, the domestic element of the war that is unpopular with the public opinion, and a threat perception element with countries concerning about Mediterranean spillover. Europe operates under a security architecture dominated by NATO and shaped by Washington priorities, a framework that structurally overlaps with the development of an autonomous EU common security and defense policy. Europe avoid deeper strategic entanglement and has limited ability to shape outcomes, focusing instead on managing risks. Its main concern is energy security, but its response capacity is uneven due to institutional constraint and political fragmentation, despite clear awareness of the threat. Internally, EU member states' conflicting national interests, divergent energy dependency, and varying relationship with the Gulf countries make consensus elusive. While EU strategy signals some cohesion, the unity remains fragile, and prolonged crisis might hinder EU effectiveness. Europe is expected to face a prolonged phase of strategic pressure marked by complex security threats, including terrorism and sabotage, economic uncertainty, and increasing political polarization. Europe's reaction is shaped by four main factors: alignment with the United States, energy needs, domestic public opinion, and the war in Ukraine. While Europe stays closely aligned with the US, it's reluctant to engage militarily in the conflict. Europe's public opinion remains divided. It's perceived in Europe that crisis might indirectly strengthen Russia by easing pressure on Russia's energy sector, further complicating Europe's strategic position. While a more extreme scenario of acute systematic stress could involve missile, drone attacks, or indirect military confrontation, the European Union is assessed to have enough capacity to absorb short-term shocks. Finally, Europe's resilience to the effect of the conflicts remains asymmetric. Europe clearly perceives the risk, but its ability to respond effectively remains limited by its institution and political fragmentation. And now allow me to read 4 points of recommendation. Europe should develop core capacity as a coherent strategic actor that acts faster, more unified, and clearer decision-making in a crisis scenario. Europe could do more by jointly assessing the consequences of the war, stating clearly where their red lines are, and finally reaching out as a bloc to the Gulf countries to coordinate diplomatically. Europe must also focus effort more on managing spillovers effects, such as defending its territory, handling migration pressure, and mitigating economic aspects. And key other areas of focus to include strengthening resilience, missile and drone defense, maritime security, and cyber defense. However, political resilience remains weak, particularly due to the challenges like digitally radicalized actors. And finally, ultimately, Europe should adapt to the new reality of today's mercantile and transactional realism in the global security affairs. If not, Europe will find it difficult to sustain its relevance and influence. With that, I would like also again to thank you for your participation in our third strategic dialogue, and we're also going to continue our fourth and fifth and sixth strategic dialogue about the war, focusing also on different regions and continents. With that, Hamdan, I hand the mic to you. Or to you, Sheikha. Sorry.
Thank you, Awad. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of today's dialogue. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, moderators, and all participants for contributing to this timely and important discussion. We hope today's session has provided deeper insight into how Europe is navigating the complexities of the current crisis and its broader geopolitical implications. Thank you for joining us, and we invite you to join us next week to explore how Latin America sees this crisis. Have a pleasant evening.